They told him not to help her, but he did. And everything changed. The dust of Redemption Creek tasted of shame. Elara knew its flavor intimately. It coated her tongue, settled in the fine hairs of her arms, and clung to the threadbare hem of the dress she had worn for 3 days straight. It was the taste of judgment, the grit of whispers that followed her from the dry goods store to the muddy patch of land by the creek she and her husband, Thomas, had called a farm. But today, the dust tasted of something sharper: despair. The sun, a merciless hammer in the vast indifferent sky, beat down on the town square. It was auction day, not for cattle or land, but for the failed dreams of men like her Thomas, God rest his soul, whose heart had given out under the strain of a failed crop and the weight of a debt he could never repay. Elara stood beside the auction block, a ghost in her own life. Her belly, swollen with the child she now had to raise alone, was a constant, aching reminder of everything she had lost and everything she was about to lose. The townspeople gathered, a flock of vultures, in their Sunday best. Sheriff Miller, a man whose piety was as thin as his smile, read from a ledger, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "The assets of the late Thomas Miller," he began, and Elara flinched at the name, a fresh stab of grief. He wasn't Thomas Miller. He was Thomas Gable. But the sheriff, brother to the banker who held the note on their land, had a cruel way of twisting the knife. He was erasing Thomas, piece by piece. One by one, their meager possessions were held up and sold for a pittance. The plow Thomas had carved by hand, the quilt her mother had made for her wedding day, its colors faded but its stitches still strong. Each sale was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She felt the eyes on her, a mixture of pity, scorn, and a chilling, predatory curiosity. They saw a widow, a pauper, a burden. And with every passing moment, the life inside her felt less like a promise and more like a sentence. The heat intensified. Black spots danced at the edge of her vision. Her hand went to her belly, a protective, desperate gesture. "Not now, little one," she prayed, her lips moving silently. "Just a little longer, please." But the world was tilting. The jeering faces and the auctioneer's drone blurring into a nauseating swirl of sound and light. The dust rose, thick and suffocating. She heard a woman's sharp gasp, then a man's low murmur. Disgraceful. Bringing her out in her condition, the ground rushed up to meet her. As she fell, the last thing she saw was the face of a man, standing at the edge of the crowd, leaning against the blacksmith's post. A stranger. His face was a mask of stone, weathered and hard, but his eyes held a storm of something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, something that mirrored the desolation in her own soul. Then, darkness took her, a welcome silent blanket against the cruelty of the sun. He had watched her from the moment she'd been led to the square. Caleb Travers was not a man who frequented town. The solitude of his ranch, nestled in the high, lonely plains miles from Redemption Creek, was his sanctuary and his prison. He'd come for salt and flour, nothing more. But he had stopped, rooted to the spot by the sight of her. He knew loss. It was carved into the lines around his eyes, in the permanent set of his jaw. He had buried his own wife, Martha, and their stillborn son on the same winter day 5 years ago, and the silence of his cabin had been screaming ever since. He saw the same silence in the woman's eyes, even across the square. He saw the hollowed-out look of someone who was already a ghost, just waiting for the wind to scatter her. When she fell, a collective shudder went through the crowd, but no one moved. Not the sheriff, not the banker, not the pious women who clutched their Bibles and whispered behind their hands. They stared as if she were a fallen animal, a spectacle of ruin. But Caleb moved. It wasn't a choice. It was an instinct, a pull from a part of himself he thought had died with Martha. He pushed through the gawking townsfolk, his boots heavy on the dusty ground. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her pale, sweat-sheened face. He felt the fragile pulse in her neck, the faint warmth of her skin. He saw the gentle mound of her belly, and a pain so sharp and familiar lanced through him that he almost recoiled. A child. A life clinging to another life that was slipping away. "Stand back, Travers," Sheriff Miller commanded, his voice laced with authority. "This is town business." Caleb didn't look up. He gently brushed a strand of sweat-damp hair from her forehead. He could hear the whispers now, sharp and venomous. "That's the Travers fellow, the one who lost his wife. Lives up on the ridge like a wolf. What's he doing?" He ignored them. He looked at the woman's face, at the faint lines of worry etched around her eyes even in unconsciousness, at the chapped lips that had silently formed a prayer. He saw not a burden, but a reflection of his own shattered world. He had come to town for supplies, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not leave her here. To leave her would be to leave a part of his own soul to be trampled in the dust. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, finally landing on the sheriff. His voice, when it came, was low and rough from disuse, but it carried across the silent square with the force of a breaking storm. "The auction, is it over?" Sheriff Miller, taken aback, straightened his posture. "The land is all that's left. And her husband's debt, $150. He said the sum with a sneer, knowing it was an impossible amount. For a woman with nothing, he was making a point. He was breaking her completely. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He looked back down at the woman, then at the hostile faces surrounding them. He had a choice. He could walk away. He could retreat to his silent cabin and let this woman and her unborn child be consumed by the town's cruel charity, which was no charity at all. Or he could do the unthinkable, the insane. He could shatter his own solitude, invite a world of trouble into his life, and risk everything on a woman he didn't even know. He thought of the empty chairs at his table, the cold side of his bed, the endless, echoing quiet. He reached into his coat, his hand closing around the worn leather pouch that held the savings of 5 lonely years. He stood up slowly, a tall, imposing figure against the harsh sun. He walked to the auction block, his steps deliberate and heavy. He didn't count the money. He didn't have to. He knew exactly what was in there. He dropped the pouch onto the ledger with a solid final thud. $150, Caleb said, his voice resonating with a power that stunned the crowd into silence. He turned his head, his gaze finding the banker, Mr. Miller, standing beside his brother. The sheriff. For the debt and the land. He paused, letting his words sink in, letting the weight of his actions settle over the town square. Then he turned back to the sheriff, his eyes like chips of flint. "And I'll take her too." The words hung in the air, electric and irreversible. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't an offer of help. It was a claim, as stark and absolute as the land itself. He had bought her life, her future, her child. He turned without another word, walked back to the woman who was just beginning to stir, and gently, carefully, lifted her into his arms. He carried her through the stunned, silent sea of faces, away from the auction block, away from the town that had condemned her. He didn't look back. He just walked, his burden impossibly light, toward the long, dusty road that led to his solitary ranch, the silence of the plains waiting to receive them both. The dust of Redemption Creek settled behind him, but for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Travers felt like he was walking away from the ghosts, not toward them. The journey to the ranch was a blur of jolting wagon wheels and the suffocating heat of the late afternoon. Ilara drifted in and out of consciousness, the world a muddle of sensations. The rough texture of a man's wool coat against her cheek, the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart beneath her ear, the scent of pine, leather, and something else. Something like clean earth after a rain. When she finally opened her eyes for good, she was lying on a simple cot in a room she didn't recognize. The light was soft, filtered through a single clean window. A fire crackled softly in a stone hearth, chasing away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. For a moment, she felt a disorienting sense of peace. Then memory came rushing back, a brutal, icy flood. The auction, the fall, the stranger's eyes. She sat up with a gasp, her hand flying to her belly. The child was still there, a gentle flutter beneath her palm. She was safe, but where was she? The cabin was small, just one room, but it was meticulously clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Shelves holding a few plates and tins lined one wall. It was a place of stark simplicity, of a life stripped down to its barest essentials. It was a man's home. His home. The door opened, and he entered, filling the frame. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broad under a faded blue shirt. He carried a bucket of water, which he set down quietly by the hearth. He didn't look at her immediately, instead busying himself with adding a log to the fire. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Where am I? She finally managed to ask, her voice a dry whisper. He turned then, and his eyes met hers. The storm was still there, but it was calmer now, like the sky after a tempest has passed. My name is Caleb Travers. This is my ranch. Why? The word was all she had. Why did you help me? Why did you bring me here? What do you want from me? He seemed to understand all the questions packed into that single word. He pulled one of the chairs from the table and sat down a careful distance away. He didn't crowd her. The town was no place for you, not today. You paid the debt, she said, the realization dawning on her with a fresh wave of humiliation. You bought my land. She couldn't bring herself to say the other part. You bought me. The debt is paid, he confirmed, his voice even. The land is yours, your child's. She stared at him, bewildered. This wasn't what she expected. She had braced herself for a demand, a price for his charity. I have no way to repay you. I'm not asking for repayment, he said, and his gaze dropped to the floor, as if the words were difficult for him. The cabin is small, but it's sturdy. The land is hard, but it's honest. There's a well with sweet water. It's a place to start, a place to start. The words echoed in the quiet room. She had thought her life was over. She had been prepared for the poorhouse, for the forced separation from her child, for a life of shame and servitude. And now this silent, wounded man was offering her a beginning. It was too much to comprehend. She felt a surge of suspicion, a lifetime of hardship having taught her that kindness always came with a price. What do you want, Mr. Travers? She asked, her voice sharper this time, a shield against the hope that was threatening to crack through her despair. He looked up, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the profound loneliness he carried. My wife, she died 5 years ago. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The words filled the cabin with their own heavy history. The quiet is loud, he said, the admission costing him. I have a bunk in the barn. It's warm enough. You and the child can have the cabin. He was offering her a home, a sanctuary. But he was also asking for something in return, something he couldn't name. He was asking her to fill the silence. He was asking her to bring life back into a place where it had died. The thought was terrifying. She was broken, a vessel of grief and fear. How could she possibly heal this man's cavernous sorrow when her own was still a raw, open wound? The days that followed were a silent, awkward dance. They were two strangers bound together by a desperate act, orbiting each other in the vast, empty landscape. There was no easy comfort, no sudden kinship. There was only the brutal, relentless work of survival. Caleb was a man of routine. He rose before the sun, his movements economical and precise. He would leave a bucket of fresh milk on the cabin doorstep and be gone, disappearing into the hills with his rifle or his axe, not to return until dusk. He never entered the cabin while she was there, affording her a privacy that was both a relief and a source of profound isolation. Alara, in turn, threw herself into the work of making the cabin a home. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She mended the curtains with thread pulled from her own tattered dress. She learned the quirks of the wood stove, coaxing it to life each morning to bake small, dense loaves of bread from the flour Caleb had bought. The physical labor was a balm, a way to quiet the frantic thoughts in her head, but the silence was a constant companion. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their words were clipped, functional. The wood is low. I saw a fox near the chickens. It will rain tonight. Each sentence was a stone dropped into a deep well, the ripples fading into the overwhelming quiet. There were moments of clumsy tenderness that were almost painful to watch. One evening, she found a small hand-carved bird on the windowsill, its lines simple but perfect. She never mentioned it, and he never acknowledged leaving it, but she kept it on the mantelpiece, a tiny, unspoken symbol of something. Another day, he returned to find a bowl of hot stew waiting for him on a crate outside the barn. He ate it in the fading light, his back to the cabin, but she watched his silhouette from the window, her heart a tight, aching knot in her chest. They were two ghosts haunting the same piece of land, each afraid to touch the other for fear they might pass right through. The pain was a palpable thing between them. She would sometimes catch him staring at her belly with a look of such profound, bottomless grief that she would have to turn away, her own sorrow rising to choke her. And he would sometimes see her staring out at the endless plains, her eyes vacant, and he would feel the familiar chill of his own loneliness wrap around him like a shroud. They were both trapped in their pasts, unable to move forward, yet bound together in the present. One night, a storm rolled in, a violent, terrifying onslaught of wind and rain. The cabin, which had felt so sturdy, now seemed fragile against the fury of the elements. Thunder cracked overhead, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Ilara, startled from a restless sleep, cried out. The door to the cabin flew open, and Caleb stood there, silhouetted against a flash of lightning, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against the storm. She couldn't speak, only nod, her hands clutching the thin blanket. He stepped inside, letting the door slam shut behind him. The small room suddenly felt even smaller with his presence. He didn't leave. He walked to the hearth and stoked the fire, his movements calm and steady, an anchor in the chaos. He pulled a chair close to the fire but sat on the floor, his back against the wall, keeping a silent vigil. He didn't speak, but his presence was a comfort, a solid, reassuring weight in the storm-tossed night. Alara watched him in the flickering firelight, the hard lines of his face softened by the fire. Warm glow. She saw the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders, the deep-seated weariness of a man who had been alone for too long. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear and suspicion she had clung to for so long began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative shoot of trust. He had not asked for anything. He had not demanded anything. He had simply been there. He had weathered the storm with her. When the storm finally passed and the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, he stood up to leave. At the door, he paused, his back still to her. "Martha." "My wife," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. She was afraid of storms. He left without another word, but the confession lingered in the air, a precious, heartbreaking gift. He had shared a piece of his pain with her. It was a beginning, a real one. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken understanding of two broken souls who were, ever so slowly, learning to heal. The whispers from Redemption Creek eventually found their way up the winding path to the ranch. They came on the wind, carried by the wind. Few neighbors who dared to make the journey. An old rancher looking for a stray calf. A woman selling eggs from a nearby farm. Their eyes would linger on Alara's swelling belly, then shift to Caleb's stoic face, their minds churning with gossip and speculation. "He paid off your husband's debt," one man said, his tone a mixture of awe and suspicion. "A fool and his money, some are sayin'." "They say in town you bought her," a woman whispered to Caleb one afternoon, her eyes sharp and judgmental as she watched Alara tending a small garden they had planted near the cabin. "Like a broodmare, it ain't right, Travers." "It ain't." "Christian." Caleb's face would harden, his jaw tightening, but he never offered an explanation. He would simply finish his business and retreat back into his work, his silence a wall against their intrusion. But Alara felt the sting of their words. Bought. The word was a brand, a mark of shame that she couldn't wash away. She had started to feel safe, to feel a sense of dignity returning, but the town's judgment was a constant reminder of her fall. Some of the judgment was more direct. The banker, Mr. Miller, rode out one day with the sheriff, a pretense of checking on the caution property lines. His eyes roamed over the small improvements they had made, the repaired fence, the thriving garden, the clean-swept porch, and his lip curled in a sneer. "Playing house, Travers?" Miller asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think this little charity project of yours changes anything? She's still a pauper. And that child." He let his gaze rest on Alara's belly with open contempt. A bastard born into debt. Before Caleb could react, Alara stepped forward, her chin held high. The fear she had felt in the town square was gone, replaced by a cold, protective fire. "This child is a Gable," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And this land belongs to him. My husband worked it, and I will work it. We owe you nothing." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, but the banker just laughed, a short, ugly sound. "We'll see about that. A woman alone with a newborn? The town has an interest in the welfare of its children." It was a threat, veiled but unmistakable. A threat of custody, of taking her child, the one thing she had left in the world. They rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy sense of dread. The fragile peace of the ranch had been shattered. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was heavy, fraught with the fear of what was to come. Caleb didn't retreat to the barn. He sat at the table, his big hands resting on the rough wood, his knuckles white. "He can't do it," Alara whispered, more to herself than to him. "He can't take my baby." Caleb looked at her, his eyes dark with a grim reality. A man like Miller, with the sheriff in his pocket. He can do whatever he wants. He can make a court believe anything. That you're an unfit mother, that you're my whore. The word was ugly, and he said it with self-loathing, as if he were blaming himself for putting her in this position. The raw honesty of his words stole her breath. He was right. Their arrangement, born of desperation and a strange, unspoken compassion, looked sordid and indefensible to the outside world. They had no protection, no legitimacy. They were two outcasts, vulnerable to the whims of a cruel and powerful man. But not everyone in the community was against them. An elderly woman named Sarah, whose own farm bordered theirs to the east, began to visit. She was a widow herself, her face a roadmap of hardship and resilience. She never spoke of the gossip. Instead, she brought gifts: a jar of preserved peaches, a bundle of herbs for cooking, a hand-knitted blanket for the baby. She would sit with Alara for hours, sharing stories of her own struggles, her own triumphs. Her presence was a quiet act of solidarity, a defiant stitch against the unraveling fabric of the town's judgment. One afternoon, Sarah watched Caleb chopping wood, his movements powerful and rhythmic. "He's a good man," she said to Alara, her voice soft. "Broken, like a wild horse that's been mistreated. But good, he just needs to learn to trust again. So do you." Her words resonated with a truth that Alara was just beginning to accept. The walls they had built around their hearts were not just to keep the world out. They were to keep each other out too. The fear of being hurt again was a prison they had both willingly inhabited. As the weeks turned into months, and Alara's time grew near, the threat from the town loomed larger. The small acts of defiance from people like Sarah were heartening, but they were not enough to turn the tide of public opinion. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. A barren woman? Some said of her, twisting the knife of her past miscarriages, a pain she had shared with no one but Thomas. A widow with another man's child, others sneered. The narrative was being set, and they were being cast as the villains in their own story. They were standing on a precipice, and they both knew that the final test, the fight for their fragile unborn family, was coming. It would be public, it would be brutal, and it would force them to choose, stand and fight together, or lose everything they had so painstakingly begun to build. The first snow of winter was a delicate whisper, a promise of the harshness to come. It was on that cold, clear morning that the baby decided to arrive. It came with a fierce, sudden urgency, as if it knew it had to fight its way into a world that was already set against it. Sarah was there, her hand steady and her voice a low, calming murmur. Caleb paced outside the cabin, his stoic facade crumbling with every one of Alara's cries. He was a ghost again, transported back to another cold day, another woman's struggle, another life lost. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping his heart. But this time was different. After hours of agonizing labor, a new sound broke the stillness of the winter morning, the strong, angry cry of a healthy baby boy. When Sarah finally opened the door, her face weary but triumphant, Caleb stumbled inside. The air was thick with the scent of birth, of life. Alara lay on the cot, pale and exhausted, but her eyes were shining with a light he had never seen before. And in her arms, wrapped in the blanket Sarah had knitted, was a tiny, perfect child. He approached the bed slowly, hesitantly, as if he were afraid the scene would vanish if he moved too quickly. Alara looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips. "A boy," she whispered. "He looks like Thomas." Caleb nodded, his throat tight. He looked at the child, at his tiny wrinkled face and his shock of dark hair, and he felt not the familiar stab of his own loss, but a new, overwhelming emotion, a fierce, primal wave of protectiveness. This child, this small, vulnerable life, was a part of this land now, a part of this home, a part of him. But their peace was short-lived. Less than a week later, Sheriff Miller and the banker arrived, this time with a court order. The paper, signed by a judge who was a cousin of the Millers, declared Alara an unfit mother and granted temporary custody of the infant, pending a formal hearing to the town of Redemption Creek. It was a kidnapping sanctioned by law. "You can't do this," Alara screamed, clutching the baby to her chest as the sheriff advanced. She was a lioness protecting her cub, her eyes blazing with a fury that was terrifying to behold. Caleb stepped in front of her, his body a solid wall. "Get off my land," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous thunder. "It's not your land, Travers," the banker sneered, holding up the court order like a shield. "It belongs to the child, and the court has deemed that the child's welfare is at risk. Now stand aside, or I'll have the sheriff arrest you for obstruction." The whole town, it seemed, had come to watch. They stood at the edge of the property, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction. This was the climax of the drama they had been whispering about for months. The outcasts were finally getting their comeuppance. Illyra's cries turned to sobs, a desperate, heartbreaking sound that tore through Caleb's soul. He looked at her, at the raw terror in her eyes, and he knew he couldn't let this happen. He had lived in the shadow of death for 5 years, a passive, broken man. But this was about life. He turned to face the crowd, his gaze sweeping over their judgmental faces. He saw the whispers, the scorn, the self-righteousness. And he decided he was done with silence. "You want to talk about what's fit?" He called out, his voice ringing with a power that silenced the murmurs. "You want to talk about what's right?" He pointed a shaking finger at the banker. "This man, who would have left a pregnant widow to starve in the street, wants to talk about welfare? This town, that stood by and watched her collapse in the dust, wants to talk about what's best for her child." He took a step forward, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. "I'll tell you what's not fit. A town that preys on the weak. A law that serves the greedy. A people who mistake cruelty for piety." He turned back to Alara, his expression softening. He reached out and gently touched the baby's head. "This woman," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "has more strength and dignity in her little finger than this entire town combined. She has fought for this child. She has scrubbed this floor, tilled this hard soil, and faced your scorn. With her head held high, she has made this place a home." He looked back at the crowd, his gaze unwavering. "You see 2 broken people. You see shame. You see sin." He paused, his voice dropping to a raw, vulnerable whisper. "I see a second chance." Then he did something that shocked everyone, including himself. He knelt on the cold, hard ground, right there in front of the whole town. He looked up at Alara, his heart in his eyes. "Alara Gable," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "I am a lonely, broken man. I have nothing to offer you but my name, my protection, and a heart that is, for the first time in a long time, starting to heal. I am asking you, in front of God and this town that has judged you so harshly, to do me the honor of becoming my wife. Let me be a father to this boy. Let us be a family." A stunned, absolute silence fell over the clearing. The sheriff stood frozen, the court order hanging limply in his hand. The banker's jaw was slack with disbelief. Alara stared down at Caleb, tears streaming down her face, blurring his image. He was not buying her. He was not saving her. He was joining her. He was offering her not just a name, but a shield. A partnership. A family, forged not in a church or by a preacher, but right here, in the dirt, in the face of their accusers. She looked from Caleb's earnest, upturned face to the son in her arms, then out at the hostile crowd. And she knew this was their only chance. It was a desperate, crazy, beautiful chance. With a trembling hand, she reached out and placed it in his. "Yes," she whispered, the word a prayer, a promise, a new beginning. "Yes." Caleb stood up, his hand enfolding hers. He turned to face the sheriff, his new authority settling on him like a mantle. "This is my wife," he said, his voice ringing with finality, "and this is my son. Now get off my land." The sheriff looked from Caleb's unyielding face to the banker's sputtering rage, then at the silent, uncertain crowd. The tide had turned. The narrative had been ripped from their hands. They were no longer watching the downfall of 2 outcasts. They were witnessing the birth of a family. Defeated, the sheriff lowered the paper, turned, and walked away. The banker, after a final, venomous glare, followed him. One by one, the crowd dispersed, their whispers now laced with a grudging, bewildered respect. They had come for a spectacle of ruin, but they had been shown a testament of love. They were married a week later, not in a church, but under the vast open sky, on the land they had fought for. Sarah stood as their witness, her weathered face beaming. The baby, nestled in a sling against Alara's chest, slept through this simple ceremony. Caleb, his voice steady, spoke the vows he had written himself, promises not of wealth or ease, but of shared burdens, of steadfast protection, of a home filled with warmth against the cold. Ilara, her voice soft but sure, promised him the same. They sealed their vows not with a ring, for they had none, but with a simple, tender kiss that spoke of shared pain and the hope of a shared future. Their home was not repaired. It was reborn. The silence was gone, replaced by the gurgles and cries of a baby, by the low murmur of their voices in the evening, by the sound of laughter, a sound so new and strange it felt like a miracle. The scars were still there, etched into their hearts, and into the land itself, but they were no longer signs of weakness. They were reminders of their strength, of the battles they had fought and won together. The community, humbled and changed by what they had witnessed, began to see them not as outcasts, but as pioneers of a different sort. They were a family formed not by blood, but by a fierce, defiant choice. They were two broken halves who had found a way to become whole, not by erasing their pasts, but by building a future on top of them. Their love story wasn't a fairy tale of instant passion. It was a testament to the slow, difficult, and beautiful work of healing. It was a story of redemption, not in a creek or a town, but in the quiet, sacred space between two human hearts. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ilara stood on the porch, watching Caleb hold their son. He was pointing out the constellations, his deep voice a gentle rumble as he named the stars for the boy who would carry his name. The child, whose name was Daniel Thomas Travers, reached up with a tiny hand and touched Caleb's rough, weathered cheek. And Caleb, the solitary man, the ghost of the high plains, closed his eyes and leaned into the touch, a single, silent tear tracing a path through the dust on his face. They had been told not to help each other, that their brokenness was a contagion. But they had reached for each other in the darkness anyway, and in doing so, had not just found love, but had redefined it. They were the proof that sometimes, the most beautiful families are the ones we build from the wreckage of our lives.